My mother taught church school for many years, and one day she had a young boy who was reading the Bible and having difficulty, as many of us do, with the names in the Bible. And so she said, "Well, when you come to a name that's that complex and difficult to pronounce, don't let it get in your way. Just skip it." A few minutes later, she overheard him reading, "Skip it, the son of Skip it, begat Skip it, the son of Skip it," and so forth. You know, we're all tempted to do that when it comes to genealogies. It looks like they're boring and of no interest whatsoever. And yet, what we find is that some genealogies have a lot of information in them. Specifically, two of the genealogies that people rely on a great deal are the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11, because they have ages attached to them. They're the only ones in Genesis that have ages attached to the names of the people in the line. And so from that, some think they can derive the age of the earth, and some don't. But is there any particular significance to these two genealogies? Well, my answer is surprisingly yes. And we'll look at that in just a second. So, what is it about the genealogies in 5 and 11 that make them so unique and make them worth all of the effort that we sometimes put into them? Well, I'm going to explain that here in a second. And I hope that you find it as illuminating and as useful as I always have. When we read the genealogy in Genesis 5, it has this formula, and you can see it here in the very first part of it. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. After he became the father of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years, and then he died. Well, let's look at it because we can get the formula from this. It happens over and over again. When name A had lived a number of years, he became the father of name B. Name A lived number 2 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, name A lived a total number of number 1 plus number 2 years, and then he died. Well, that is to say, it happens every time except for a couple. And we'll be looking specifically at one of them. We won't have time to go into everything. For example, the very first one says that when Adam lived 130 years, and he begat a son in his own likeness and in his own image, which mirrored the words from creation. And there's a reason for that. It's the only one in both these genealogies that says that, but we don't have time to look at that right now. The other end is really just as fascinating because that's where, for our purposes, the important information is. And so I've just done a little graph here, a diagram of these ages. And the blue is how long says how long they lived until they had their first son, or until they had a son. I shouldn't say first son, as we'll see, that's not that simple. How long until they had the son who's in this lineage, and then how many years they lived afterwards. So Adam, for example, lived 130 years. He begat Seth, as we said, in his image and in his likeness, which is the only one in both these genealogies where that's said. And then he lived 800 more years and had other sons and daughters, and he lived a total of 930 years, and he died, and so forth. And this formula goes on and on and on for every one of these. And you see Adam and Seth and Enosh and Kenan and Mahalalel and Jared and Enoch. And Enoch, you see, has that very short lifespan. We'll get to that just briefly. Methuselah, of course, my mother, the school teacher, also had this riddle for me: who was the oldest man who ever lived, but died before his father did? And that was Methuselah, who was 969. But of course, Enoch walked with God, and Enoch didn't die. Lamech, and finally to Noah. But the interesting thing is that when you get to Noah, all the rules stop, and they're very different. Now, I'm going to mention right here, because we don't have much time for this. I don't want to take a lot of time, but these numbers may or may not be literal, and they may or may not be symbolic. They seem to be certainly symbolic. And the perfect example of that is when it comes to Enoch, who lived, we're told, 65 years and begat a son, begat Methuselah. And then he lived 300 years, but he didn't die. He was no more, for God took him. Now, the real question is, why do we care how long he was here? He didn't die. So what does it matter if he lived 300 years if he just kept living on and on and on and on? He didn't die. He doesn't terminate at that point. He keeps living. But somehow we have to know these 300 years that passed. Well, the answer is actually very interesting. If you count from the bottom up, from Adam, Adam is 1, Seth is 2, Enosh is 3, Kenan is 4, Mahalalel is 5, Jared is 6, and Enoch is the 7th generation. And of course, 7 in Scripture in the Old Testament is the number of perfection. It's also the number of maturity or completion. And so at the 7th generation, you have this man who is translated. So in some sense, he's perfect. I'm not saying he was sinless. Clearly, he was not. In some sense, he was the completion. There's a real sense here. And as it turns out, his total age would be 365. In other words, a year for every day in a year. So the year for day principle goes back at least this far. And it shows that he's the complete man. He is the 7th generation, and he is 365. Again, he's not the Savior. He's not sinless, but it is interesting that we have to know. They want us to know that he's 365 years old. That 365 is the time we have recorded for him. He's older than that, obviously. So there you go. We have that Genesis 5 formula. We talked about this already. But here's the interesting thing. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So he doesn't live a certain number of time and have a son and then live a certain number of years afterwards. That's not in this genealogy. Yes, he does live afterwards, but there's some very unusual things about this. And the real question we have is, because the line is going to continue, although it's not going to continue exactly the way we expect, with Shem. And the question is, how old was Noah when Shem was born? Was now 500 years is when he had all 3 of them? Well, they weren't triplets. We know that. We also know that Shem was not the one who was born when Noah was 500 years old. So, but the strange thing is how we know that. Because unlike all the other generations, we don't have a statement that Noah was the father of Shem, and Shem was the father of Arphaxad, and so forth. It just says that Noah, when he was 500 years, he had these 3 sons. And again, they were not triplets, and Shem was not the first one. So there's something unusual about that. That's the Genesis 5 formula, and Noah doesn't fit it, and Adam doesn't fit it. But Noah, especially when he's 500 years old, he became the father of the 3. Now we have Shem, as in Genesis 11, we have another genealogy, and this one also has ages attached to it, which makes it convenient because then we can attach these numbers and go back. That's what at least Bishop Usher thought would work. There are, again, because these numbers may be in some sense symbolic, and because the Hebrew approach to genealogy is different than ours. They use them for a different purpose. We can see that readily in Matthew and Luke, for example. But anyway, their genealogies were used for a different purpose. So it's a little odd. We can't really just take those numbers and add them up. Besides which, as we shall see, both of these genealogies are linked to an event, but they are neither one linked to the age of the earth. There is no indication that any of the biblical authors were interested in that question, the age of the earth. We're interested. They weren't. So you have Shem. And as you see, Shem lives a very, very long time. In fact, if you look up, you can see that he did live, he perhaps, according to these numbers, died later than Abram. Abraham died before Shem died. Very possible. So Shem lives for a time and as the father of Arphaxad. And I have to ask this, what in the world do you call that kid for short? Arphaxad is the father of Selah, who's the father of Eber, who begets Peleg, who begets Ru, who begets Serug, who begets Nahor. Now we're into familiar territory. Who begets Terah, who begets Abram. And you'll notice that a couple of things is one is that after Eber, the ages shorten rapidly. They really get shorter in a hurry. Now they're still long by our standards, but they get shorter in a hurry. And you can see here that Shem definitely lived long enough that he could have been alive when Abraham was there. So this is important because there is a Hebrew tradition, a Jewish rabbinic tradition, that Shem was Melchizedek. And we'll look at that. Of course, Melchizedek is simply a compound word. Melchi is Hebrew for king, and Sedek is righteousness. And the same root is used in then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Sedek made Sedek. So Melchizedek is the king of righteousness, which it literally says in the translation. But you may not notice something. It's not as obvious as you'd like because there's this odd thing. If you look at Shem, and depending on the size of the display you have, it may be easy to see, may not be. But I'm going to take a look at it here, and I'm going to blow it up for us. And if you look very closely, there's a little tiny black, there's a little tiny blue thing there. And the thing is that Shem was born before the flood. But we know how old he was, not from any other number, but because he's related to the flood. Both of these genealogies are linked not to the age of the earth, but to the flood. Clearly, and we'll see this in more detail as we go here. The author of Genesis wants us, and I'm not going to get into JEDP. I'm just going to get into that right now. But the author of Genesis clearly wants us to believe, to understand that these are both linked to the flood. How is that so? Well, it says that Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters came on the earth. His age is linked directly to the flood. And then we have that little blue thing down there on Shem's life. That is 2 years after the flood, when he was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. So we can't, his age is not linked to the age of Noah. Noah had, he lived 500 years and then had these 3 sons. But as we'll see, the math doesn't work out. Shem couldn't have been the first one. And so both of these genealogies, the only age that is linked to an event is Noah's age for the first one and Shem's age for the second genealogy, and they're both linked to the flood directly. And as I said, there is no single statement that says Noah begat Shem, as there is the other. It says Noah lived 500 years and he begat these 3. So it's a break in the whole genealogy thing. Now, just doing some simple math, if you remember, it says that Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters came. It also says then later on that he was 601 when they were able to come off of the ark, so the flood was done. So then it was 2 years after the flood when Shem was 100 years old. So he was 100 years old 2 years after the flood. And so Noah was 601 when the flood ended. So 2 more years Noah would be 603. And Shem was 100 years old, but it was 2 years after the flood. So he was born 98 years before the flood. And so he was probably born when Noah was about 505. But that link is never explicitly mentioned. Something we can only come up with this way. And again, if the numbers are symbolic rather than literal, and let me get out of the way just briefly here so that you don't have any problem with that. You see that very clearly. If these numbers are symbolic rather than literal, then it may be something else entirely. The point is, those ages are not linked. The author of Genesis didn't want us to connect them. I don't know why exactly. I can speculate, which is what I'm going to do, but I don't know. We're not told. So let's take a look at the following. Here we have the two genealogies. I put them in a table, listed in order: Adam, Seth, Enos, and so forth, from first to last. Shem through Abram. The pre-flood, there's exactly 10 generations in each of these two. These are the only two genealogies that have numbers associated with the ages in Genesis, and these are exactly 10 generations in each one. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Old Testament are getting suspicious probably very quickly, because there's a lot of parallels going on here, and you have exactly 10 generations. It probably means something else is up, and we're on to something which we'll get into in a second. Let's just compare the first generation of the second genealogy, Shem, with the last generation of the first genealogy, the last, because they mirror each other, the pre-flood and the post-flood genealogies. All right, there were 10 generations. We just mentioned that. They both have 10 generations exactly. The last generation is Noah, of the pre-flood one. The first generation of the post-flood one is his son Shem, but they are never linked directly in that sense in the account here in Genesis. Noah lives 500 years before the flood story begins. The flood story begins when he's 500 years old. The flood begins when he's 600 years old. But the story begins, it says that he was 500 years old. So it's they're linked. It mentions that it's his age before Shem and Japheth are born. But it also mentions 500 years as at the beginning of the flood story. When he was 500 years, God comes to him and says these things. Shem lives 500 years after the flood story. 500, because it's 502 perhaps. But he's 2 years after the flood. He's 100 years old. So you have this, and for the Hebrew reckoning, this is probably close enough. I mean, we have to be honest. They're not looking for the kind of precision that we do, and there are a lot of examples of this in both Old and New Testaments. Noah is 600 years old at the flood, Genesis 7:6, and Shem is 600 years old when he dies. So you have these two events. You have these two characters in this genealogy, and you have exactly 10 generations. So again, probably a lot of you have seen this coming, but I'm just going to put it up here. If you put all 20 generations in a row, you start with Adam, you end with Abraham, or Abram. I use it here, was what he was named when he was born. And you have Noah and Shem, you see there in the center, which they're a bridge, because both of them, and only those two in this genealogy, are born before the flood and survive through the flood and live after the flood. They are literally the human bridge in this genealogy. I'm not talking about Shem and Japheth. Obviously, they were too, but they're not in this genealogy. In this genealogy, Noah and Shem are the human bridge from the world before the flood, the antediluvian world, to the world we live in now, the post-diluvian world. Okay? So that's where this works out. So those are your two. So if, again, probably a lot of you have seen this coming. If you have 10 generations and 10 generations, we've already seen the similarities and the mirroring of the last and of the old one and the first of the new one. and they both bridges over the flood. Then you know that the flood is the center of this story, and this is almost certainly a chiasm. And so we just do this, and there you have your chiasm, and that means that. And again, the flood, the event of the flood, and the two who survive it are the focus of these two genealogies. It's just too neat. So, what does all this have to do with Melchizedek and Shem and all that other stuff? Well, there's a couple of things that matter here. One is in a chiasm, as you know, the first and the last elements have something in common. They mirror each other, and so forth. And you get down to the middle, of course, and you have the two in the middle who mirror. Well, in this case, the story of Abram is going to be the story of the father of the faithful. He is going to be the progenitor of the people of God. Well, the same thing is true of Adam in the Old Testament. He's the progenitor. Now, he is the father of Cain, but Cain has a separate genealogy in chapter 4, which we don't have the time to go in with, but it is related to these genealogies. But Cain has a separate genealogy. So you have Genesis 4 is the Cain and Abel story, and it's the lineage of Cain. And so Cain is not in this, and neither is Abel, because they don't matter to this particular story. Seth is the one who matters. He is and that is probably why it's in his image and likeness. This is a new creation that's taking place here. Don't have time to go into that in full detail. But what you have then in this situation is that basically what they're telling us, this genealogy is telling us, is that Abram is the new Adam in this setting. Now, again, not getting away from what Paul says in the New Testament and all that, but of just taking this in biblical theology, you have to say, where was the audience when this was being promoted, when this was being told? And they were looking back to Abram. He was the progenitor of the faithful. He was the father of the faithful. That mattered to them. And here you see you have Abram is marrying Adam. But the other thing that happens is, and we'll go back to the other, and that is, here's our genealogy again, and you can see pretty readily that it's quite possible for Shem to be still alive when Abram makes his sacrifices to Melchizedek. And here we go. We show that somewhere in there would be where this would take place. And so it's a fascinating situation. Now, why is that happening? Well, don't forget that what takes place in this sacrifice and in this whole scenario, this narrative, is that Abram pays tithe to Shem. Now, if Abram is paying tithe to somebody, it has to be somebody of really impressive, somebody, and again, king of righteousness, Melchizedek. And so it has to be, it's as though he's paying tithe again to the godly lineage which reaches back before the flood. Shem, again, is one of these bridge characters. And we forget that it's a two-way enterprise. It's a two-way exchange. What do I mean by that? Abram, he pays tithe to Shem, but Shem blesses Abraham. And so what you have here is a sort of passing of the torch. The priest, the progenitor of this line, the direct descendant of Seth, and the one who bridges the line to the world after the flood, blesses Abram. So you have the two elements that say Abram he mirrors Adam, and Abram is blessed by Shem. So there's a sense in which, again, the torch is being passed. Abram is now going to be, it's Abram and his line that will matter from here on in. Abram will be the new Adam, the project, the chosen, seed will come through Abram. And this episode and these two genealogies, I believe, are pointing exactly there. Well, I hope that this has been useful to you. I hope it makes sense to you. If it doesn't, you can always challenge me and ask questions. But I hope that it's been useful for you. And there is a lot more if the people are interested in it. There's a lot more to do with these genealogies. We just really kind of scratched the surface. So, um, anyway, that's how these things all fit together. The genealogies in 5 and 11 are about, they center on the flood because that is what divides the world that was from the world that is now. But there's also this exchange, this passing of the torch, and Abram is now going to be the progenitor of the godly line from here on out. Thank you for joining me. I hope, again, that it's been useful, and let me know what you think.